The autumn wind carried the scent of rust and forgotten dreams through the narrow streets of Millbrook, a town where history lingered in every corner, like morning fog that refused to lift. Betty Harrison stood before the dilapidated warehouse on Elm Street, her weathered hands clutching a deed that most people would have thrown away. At 79 years old, she had learned that value and worth were rarely found where others expected them to be. The building loomed before her, 3 stories of peeling paint, broken windows, and a roof that sagged like the shoulders of someone who had carried too much for too long. The real estate agent had called it a tear-down opportunity. The neighbors called it an eyesore. Betty called it hers. She had paid almost nothing for it, a sum so small it embarrassed the broker, who processed the paperwork with visible confusion. "Mrs. Harrison," he had said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Are you absolutely certain about this? The property hasn't been occupied in over 40 years. The structural integrity is questionable at best." But Betty had simply smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that comes from living long enough to understand that certainty is a luxury of youth. She had signed the papers with a steady hand, the same hand that had buried a husband, raised 3 children alone, and learned to find strength in silence. Now, standing before her purchase in the fading October light, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: curiosity. Not the mild interest that comes from a newspaper headline or a neighbor's gossip, but the deep, pulling curiosity that whispers of purpose. The padlock on the front door surrendered easily to the key, too easily, as if it had been waiting for her. The hinges groaned as she pushed the massive door open, and the smell of dust and time washed over her like a wave from another era. Betty stepped inside, and the world behind her seemed to fade. The interior was vast, far larger than it appeared from the street. Shafts of amber sunlight pierced through the broken windows, illuminating particles of dust that danced like memories suspended in the air. The concrete floor was littered with debris, old crates, rusted machinery, fragments of a life that had ended before most people in town were born. Betty walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was something about the building that felt familiar, though she was certain she had never been inside before. It was like recognizing a song she had never heard, a melody that belonged to her soul rather than her memory. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed wooden partition, she noticed something that made her heart quicken: a door. Not the large industrial entrance she had used, but a small, almost residential door, painted a faded blue that reminded her of spring skies from childhood. She approached it carefully, testing the floorboards with each step. The door was unlocked. Beyond it, a narrow staircase climbed into shadow. Betty hesitated for only a moment before ascending, her hand gripping the rickety railing, her breath coming shorter with each step, not from exertion, but from anticipation. The stairs led to a small office space, surprisingly intact compared to the warehouse below. A desk sat against one wall, covered in a thick layer of dust. Metal filing cabinets stood like silent sentinels, and on the wall, barely visible in the dim light filtering through a grimy window, hung a painting. Betty moved closer, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The painting depicted a young woman standing in a garden, surrounded by roses in full bloom. The style was simple but skilled, the work of someone who painted from love rather than training. But it was the signature in the bottom corner that made Betty's breath catch in her throat. E.M., 1963. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers stopping just short of touching the canvas. Those initials, that year, it couldn't be. She turned to the desk, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The drawers were stuck, swollen with decades of humidity, but she pulled with determination, born from something deeper than curiosity. The first drawer yielded nothing but old invoices and shipping manifests. The second contained office supplies turned brittle with age. But the third drawer, the bottom one, held something different. A wooden box, small and delicate, with a brass clasp that had turned green with time. Betty lifted it carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands, and carried it to the window where the light was stronger. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, tied with a ribbon that had once been white, but had aged to the color of old ivory. The envelopes were addressed in careful, feminine handwriting to E.M., Elm Street Warehouse, Millbrook. Betty's hand shook as she untied the ribbon and withdrew the first letter. The paper was thin and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. She began to read, and with each word, the world around her fell away. My dearest Edward, another month has passed, and still I write to you, though these letters will never be sent. They tell me I should move forward, that I should accept what happened and build a new life. But how does one move forward when half of their soul remains anchored in the past? The warehouse stands empty now. Father closed it after everything. He says it's too painful to keep, that the memories are too heavy, but I walk past it every day, and I swear I can feel you there, in the spaces between the walls, in the dust motes that dance in the sunlight. I made a mistake, Edward, the worst mistake of my life, and I have paid for it every single day since. The letter was signed Elizabeth. Betty's vision blurred with tears she hadn't known were forming. Elizabeth, her mother's name, her mother who had died when Betty was only 5 years old, so young that Betty's memories of her were more impressions than images, feelings rather than facts. She had been told so little about her mother's life. Her father, a stern man who believed that pain should be buried rather than examined, had refused to speak of his late wife beyond the basic facts. She had been young, she had been kind, and she had loved Betty with a fierceness that transcended words. But there had always been shadows in her father's eyes when he looked at Betty, a sadness that went deeper than simple grief. And now, holding these letters in her hands, Betty began to understand why. She read letter after letter, each one a window into a love story she had never known existed. Her mother and a man named Edward, who had worked together in this very warehouse. Her grandfather's textile business, thriving in the years after the war. They had fallen in love slowly, carefully, in the way of people who understand that the best things in life are built rather than seized. But there had been an obstacle. Edward had been engaged to another woman, an arrangement made by his family, a promise he felt honor-bound to keep. Elizabeth had been the boss's daughter, expected to marry someone of means and status. Their love was impossible, and they both knew it. The letters chronicled their stolen moments, lunch breaks extended by precious minutes, chance encounters that were anything but chance, conversations that lasted long after the other workers had gone home. And then, in the spring of 1962, Elizabeth wrote of a decision that would change everything. I have chosen to end this, Edward. Not because my feelings have changed, but because they haven't. Loving you while you belong to another is slowly destroying me. Tomorrow I will tell my father that I've agreed to marry Harrison, the banker's son. He's a good man, even if he isn't you. Perhaps in time I will learn to love him. Perhaps in time this ache will fade. I'm sorry, my darling. I'm so terribly sorry. But I cannot keep living in the space between hope and heartbreak. Betty's father. Her mother had married her father as an escape from a love that had no future. The revelation hit Betty like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was so profoundly human. She read on, her tears falling freely now, each letter a step deeper into a tragedy she was only beginning to comprehend. Edward had married his fiancée as planned. Elizabeth had married Betty's father, and for a year, there had been silence between them. Then came the letter dated November 1963. Edward, I am writing to you one final time, though I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. I heard that you've moved away from Millbrook, that your marriage has taken you to the city, to a new life where the past cannot follow. I'm dying, Edward. The doctors use gentle words, but I understand what they're telling me. There's a sickness in my blood, and it's winning. I have perhaps months, perhaps less. I don't write this to cause you pain, but because there's something you need to know. Last year, before everything ended between us, we were careless one afternoon. Just once. It was beautiful and terrible and wrong, and I have regretted it every day since. Not because it happened, but because of the web of lies it has forced me to spin. I have a daughter, Edward. Her name is Betty, and she is 4 years old, and she has your eyes. Harrison believes she's his. I have never told him otherwise, and I never will. He's been a good husband and a devoted father, and he deserves better than the truth. But you deserve to know. Somewhere in this world, there is a piece of you and me, walking and laughing and living. She is smart and curious and stubborn, and she asks questions that I can barely answer because they cut so close to truths I cannot speak. I am leaving her in capable hands. Harrison will raise her well, even without knowing she isn't his by blood. But I wanted you to know that our love, impossible, painful, beautiful, created something lasting. I wanted you to know that it mattered. Elizabeth. The letter fell from Betty's hands. She stood motionless in the dusty office, her world reorganizing itself around this new, impossible truth. The man who had raised her, who had loved her with quiet constancy, had never known she wasn't his biological child, and the real father, Edward, had moved away, carrying this knowledge like a stone in his heart. Betty didn't know how long she stood there, suspended between past and present. The sun had moved significantly across the sky when she finally bent to retrieve the scattered letters. As she gathered them, she noticed something else in the box, a photograph, face down at the bottom. She turned it over with trembling hands. The image was faded, colors muted by time, but still clear enough. A young woman, her mother, though Betty had never seen her so vibrant, so alive, stood beside a man in work clothes. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold entire universes. They weren't touching in the photograph, maintaining proper distance, but everything about their posture spoke of connection, the way they leaned slightly toward each other, the mirror of their smiles, the energy that seemed to bridge the space between them. Betty studied the man's face, searching for herself in his features. And there, undeniably, were her eyes, the unusual gray-green that none of her supposed siblings shared, that her father had always remarked upon with a wistfulness she now understood. There was her jawline, her high cheekbones, the slight asymmetry of her smile. She was looking at the face of a father she had never known. The sun was setting when Betty finally descended the stairs, the box of letters clutched to her chest. The warehouse no longer felt abandoned. It felt sacred, a cathedral of secrets and sorrows and loves that refused to die even when they should have. But something was unfinished. She could feel it, a thread pulled taut between past and present, waiting to be tied off or cut. The letters had answered so many questions, but they had raised one more. What had happened to Edward? Had he ever received her mother's final confession? Had he spent the last 16 years of Elizabeth's life knowing he had a daughter he could never claim? Betty returned to the office the next morning with supplies, a broom, cleaning solutions, a lantern to supplement the failing daylight. She cleaned methodically, gently, as if the act of restoration might somehow honor the love that had been born and broken in this space. As she swept beneath the desk, her broom struck something solid. She knelt, her joints protesting the movement, and reached into the shadows. Her fingers closed around another box, this one larger and made of metal, secured with a combination lock that had rusted, but not entirely seized. Betty stared at the lock, her mind working. A combination. What numbers would her mother have chosen? She tried her own birthday. Nothing. Her parents' anniversary? Nothing. Then, on impulse, she tried the date on the first letter she had read. 061958. June 1958. The lock clicked open. Inside were more letters, but these were different. They were written in a masculine hand, bold and slanting, and they were addressed to Elizabeth. Edward had written back. He had responded to every letter she had sent, even the ones that said goodbye. Betty's heart hammered as she read them. Edward had been devastated by Elizabeth's decision to marry another man, but he had understood it. He had honored it. He had moved away, as she had heard, but not because his marriage had taken him to a new life, because staying in Millbrook, seeing her with another man, would have destroyed them both. And then she found it, the letter that changed everything. Written in Edward's hand, dated just days after her mother's death. My beloved Elizabeth, your letter found me. It will always find me, no matter where I go, because we are connected by something that distance and time and even death cannot sever. I am coming back to Millbrook. My wife and I have separated, not because of you, though you are always with me, but because we both finally acknowledge that a marriage built on obligation is no marriage at all. She deserves someone who can love her completely, and I need to see our daughter. I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect to claim her or disrupt her life, but I need to see her once, to know that some part of our love walks in this world. I'll arrive on the 15th. I'll be staying at the boarding house on Main Street. If you're strong enough, if you want to see me, send word. If you can't, if it's too painful, I'll understand. But I'll be there, Elizabeth, for as long as you need me. Forever yours. Edward. Betty's hands shook so violently that the letter fluttered like a captured bird. December 15th, 1963. She closed her eyes, reaching back through the fog of childhood memory. Her mother had died on December 18th, 1963. Betty remembered because it had been so close to Christmas, a holiday forever tainted by loss. Had they seen each other? Had Edward made it in time? The letters gave no answer. But tucked beneath Edward's final letter was something else. A newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, carefully preserved. Betty unfolded it with shaking hands. The headline was small, easy to miss in the back pages of the local paper. Local woman and visitor lost in storm Millbrook. Residents are mourning the tragic accident that claimed 2 lives yesterday evening. Elizabeth Harrison, 29, and Edward Mitchell, 31, were found deceased in a vehicle that had skidded off County Road 9 during the severe ice storm that struck the area. Mrs. Harrison had been battling illness in recent months. Mr. Mitchell was visiting from the city. Authorities believe the vehicle lost control on black ice approximately 3 miles outside of town. Mrs. Harrison is survived by her husband, Thomas Harrison, and daughter Betty, age 4. Mr. Mitchell leaves no immediate family. A joint memorial service will be held at... The newspaper clipping slipped from Betty's fingers. They had died together, her mother and her biological father, in the same moment. Under the same sky. It wasn't the ending she had expected. Not a peaceful goodbye, not a hospital room confession, but something simultaneously more tragic and more perfect. They had been together at the end. After all the years of separation, all the letters written in loneliness and longing, they had found each other one final time, and whatever had been said in that car, in those final moments before the ice and the dark, those words belonged only to them. Betty sat on the dusty floor, surrounded by letters and secrets, and wept. Not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from the overwhelming complexity of it all. Her mother, dying at 29, had chosen to spend her final hours with the man she truly loved. Her father, the man who raised her, had never known the truth, had mourned a wife who had left him twice. Once in life, once in death. And Edward? Edward had come back. He had kept his promise. In the end, love had won, even if victory looked nothing like anyone had imagined. Days turned into weeks as Betty excavated the warehouse's secrets. She found more evidence of her mother and Edward's relationship. Sketches he had drawn of her during lunch breaks, pressed flowers from the garden depicted in the painting, a small wooden bird he had carved with her initials hidden on the underside. She found evidence of her grandfather's business, order forms and ledgers that showed how the textile warehouse had thrived for decades before closing abruptly in late 1963. The official reason had been retirement, but Betty now understood the real reason. Her grandfather couldn't bear to keep open the place where his daughter had fallen in impossible love. She found Edward's toolbox, still containing the instruments he had used to maintain the machinery. Inside was a journal where he had written poetry, terrible, earnest poetry about love and longing and the cruelty of obligation. Betty read every word, hearing his voice for the first time through these written echoes. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to reconstruct not just what had happened, but who these people were. Her mother, brave enough to pursue happiness even when it defied convention, strong enough to walk away when love threatened to destroy, loving enough to give Betty a stable father, even at the cost of her own heart. Edward, honorable to a fault, trapped by promises made before he knew what love truly meant, willing to sacrifice everything for a chance to see the daughter he had never known. Betty thought often about her father, Thomas Harrison, and what he must have felt, had he suspected, on some level. Had he known? She remembered how he had looked at her sometimes, with a confusion that bordered on pain, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. She remembered how he had never remarried after her mother's death, how he had devoted himself entirely to raising Betty and her siblings, with a fierceness that now seemed like it contained an element of desperation. Perhaps he had loved her mother enough to accept whatever pieces of her he could have. Perhaps he had known the truth and chosen silence because silence was kinder than fracture. Betty would never know for certain, and she made peace with that uncertainty. On a cold December morning, exactly 2 months after she had first entered the warehouse, Betty stood in the office she had carefully restored. The painting hung on a newly repaired wall, the colors somehow brighter after a gentle cleaning. The letters were organized in 2 wooden boxes she had purchased for the purpose. One marked Elizabeth, one marked Edward, side by side as they should have been in life. The photograph of them together sat in a simple silver frame on the desk, surrounded by the other artifacts of their love, the pressed flowers, the carved bird, the poetry journal, the sketches. It was a shrine, but not a morbid one. It celebrated something that had been real and powerful and worth remembering. Betty had made decisions about the warehouse's future. She would not sell it. She would not tear it down. Instead, she was in the process of converting it into a community arts center, a place where people could create without judgment, where love in all its forms could be expressed freely, where the past and present could coexist without shame. The office, however, would remain private, a memorial accessible only to her, a place where she could come and sit with the ghosts of people who had loved better than they had been allowed to live. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Her eldest grandson, Michael, who had driven 3 hours to visit when she had told him there was something important he needed to see. At 25, he reminded her so much of the young man in the photographs. The same gray-green eyes, the same thoughtful expression, the same tendency toward poetry over practicality. "Grandma," he called softly. "You up here?" "Come in, Michael," Betty said, her voice steady. He entered the office and stopped, taking in the carefully arranged memorial. His eyes moved from the painting to the photograph to the boxes of letters, and Betty watched understanding dawn on his face. "Sit down," she said gently. "I have a story to tell you about your great-grandmother and a man named Edward, and a love that was strong enough to echo across generations." And so she told him everything, the impossible love, the painful choices, the tragic ending, the decades of secrets. She told him about DNA that skipped generations, about eyes that revealed truths no one had thought to question, about how some inheritances have nothing to do with wills or property deeds. Michael listened without interrupting, his artist's mind already weaving the story into something larger than the sum of its parts. When Betty finished, he was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the photograph of the great-grandparents he had never known he had. "Do you think they were happy?" he finally asked. "In the end, in that car before the ice took them, do you think they had enough time to be happy?" Betty considered the question, the same question she had asked herself countless times in the dark hours before dawn. "I think they had something better than happiness," she said slowly. "They had truth. After all the lies and obligations and roles they had to play, they finally had a moment of complete, unguarded truth. And maybe that's worth more than a lifetime of comfortable happiness built on pretense." Michael nodded slowly. "Why are you telling me this, Grandma? Why not my mom, or Uncle David, or—" "Because you have his eyes," Betty said simply. "And because you're an artist, like he was. And because—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because I think you need to know that the feelings you have, the ones that don't fit neatly into the boxes society provides, those feelings are your inheritance. Edward loved someone he wasn't supposed to love. Your great-grandmother chose truth over comfort, and I'm giving you permission across the generations to do the same." Michael's eyes filled with tears. Betty knew, though they had never discussed it directly, that he had been struggling with his own truth, one that involved loving someone his conservative family might not accept. She was giving him more than family history. She was giving him permission to be authentic, even when authenticity was difficult. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me with this." "Thank you for understanding what I'm really saying," Betty replied. They sat together in the office as the afternoon light shifted, talking about love and truth, and the courage it takes to honor both. Betty told him about her plans for the warehouse, about the art center that would welcome all kinds of creators, all kinds of love, all kinds of truth. "I want you to be part of it," she said. "I want you to help me build something that honors them, not by hiding what they were, but by celebrating it. A place where the Edward Mitchells and the Elizabeths of the world can exist without shame." Michael agreed without hesitation. Over the following months, the warehouse transformation accelerated. Michael moved to Millbrook, bringing with him his partner David, a gentle man who reminded Betty so much of the Edward she had reconstructed from letters and artifacts. Together, they worked to convert the massive space into studios, galleries, and workshop areas. The local community, initially skeptical about Betty's investment in the old eyesore, began to change their minds as the building took shape. Artists moved into the studios, workshops filled with teenagers learning pottery and painting. The elderly found a place to share their stories and skills, and on the wall of the main gallery, prominently displayed, was the painting Edward had created of Elizabeth in her garden. Beside it, a small plaque, "In memory of Elizabeth and Edward, who loved beyond boundaries. May this space honor all who dare to do the same." Betty didn't explain the plaque's full meaning to most visitors, but she didn't hide it either. Some truths are meant to be displayed, even if they're not fully understood by everyone who encounters them. On the anniversary of her mother's death, December 18th, Betty held a small private ceremony in the office. Just her, Michael, David, and a few close friends who knew the story. They lit candles, read from some of the letters, the less private ones, and toasted to love in all its complicated, beautiful, impossible forms. "To Elizabeth," Betty said, raising her glass of wine. "To Edward," Michael added. "To truth," David concluded. They drank in silence, the candles flickering, the old warehouse settling around them like a protective embrace. Betty thought about the path that had led her here, 79 years of life that had, in so many ways, been preparation for this moment. All the small decisions, the turns taken or not taken, the losses endured, and the joys embraced. Everything had been leading to that October day, when she had stood before a dilapidated warehouse and felt, For the first time in decades. Curiosity. She thought about destiny, whether it was real or simply a story people told themselves to make sense of chaos. She decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had found what she needed to find, learned what she needed to learn, and was now passing it forward to a generation that desperately needed to hear that love matters more than convention. As winter deepened and the Warehouse Arts Center thrived, Betty found herself spending more and more time in the office-turned-memorial. Not from sadness, but from a sense of connection that transcended time and death. She would sit at the desk, the same desk where Edward had written his poetry, and Elizabeth had hidden her letters, and feel the weight of their love like a tangible presence. Sometimes she wrote letters of her own, addressed to no one and everyone. Letters about what it meant to discover your true origin at 79. About how identity is both more fluid and more fixed than people imagine. About the way love echoes through generations like a song that refuses to end. She wrote about her father, Thomas Harrison, and how she had come to understand his love for her as no less real simply because he hadn't contributed to her DNA. He had fed her, sheltered her, guided her, believed in her. He had been her father in every way that mattered. Edward had given her life, but Thomas had given her living. Both loves were real. Both fathers were real. The heart, Betty had discovered, is large enough to hold contradictions without breaking. One February evening, as snow fell softly outside the warehouse windows, Betty received an unexpected visitor. An elderly woman, perhaps in her mid-80s, stood at the entrance to the office, clutching a worn leather handbag and looking at the memorial with an expression Betty couldn't quite read. "Can I help you?" Betty asked gently. The woman turned, and Betty saw that she had been crying. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said in a voice that trembled slightly. "I saw the plaque downstairs and the name Edward Mitchell, and I had to see." Betty's heart quickened. "Did you know Edward?" "I was engaged to him," the woman said simply. Before Elizabeth. I'm Margaret. Margaret Foster, though I've been Margaret Chen for over 60 years now." The woman Edward had been obligated to marry. The obstacle that had made his love for Elizabeth impossible. Betty stood frozen, unsure how to navigate this unexpected intersection of past and present. Margaret stepped further into the office, her eyes taking in the letters, the painting, the photographs. "I heard he died in an accident," she said quietly, "with a local woman. I didn't know the details. We had separated by then, and I tried to forget him, to move forward." "Did you?" Betty asked. "Move forward?" Margaret smiled, a complicated expression that held both yes and no. "I married a wonderful man named James. We had 4 children, 12 grandchildren, a good life. James died 2 years ago, and for the first time in decades, I found myself thinking about Edward, about what might have been different if I had been brave enough to release him from our engagement when I knew his heart was elsewhere." She looked directly at Betty. "You're her daughter, aren't you?" "Elizabeth's daughter." Betty nodded slowly. "And his, though I only discovered that recently." Margaret's eyes widened, then softened. "Of course you are. You have his eyes. I should have seen it immediately." She paused, studying Betty's face. "Does this bring you peace or pain, knowing?" "Both," Betty answered honestly, "and everything in between." Margaret moved to the desk, her fingers hovering over the photograph of Edward and Elizabeth. "May I?" she asked. "Please." Margaret picked up the frame, and for a long moment, she simply stared at the image of her former fiancé with the woman he had truly loved. Betty waited, unsure what reaction to expect. Anger, jealousy, resentment. But when Margaret finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "They look happy here. Really happy. The kind of happy Edward and I never managed, no matter how hard we tried to force it." She set the photograph down carefully. "I'm glad he had this, even if it was brief, even if it was impossible." The two women, connected by a man long dead, by choices made decades ago, by loves that had shaped them in different ways, stood together in the quiet office. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Millbrook in white, covering the old scars and mistakes with something clean and new. "Would you like to read some of the letters?" Betty asked. "I think Edward would want you to understand." Margaret considered, then shook her head. "No, those are between them. I had my time with Edward, my version of him. This," she gestured to the memorial, "this is theirs, and now yours. I just needed to see that he was remembered with love, that his story wasn't forgotten." "He is," Betty assured her, "and it isn't." Margaret smiled, and suddenly she looked years younger, the weight of old what-ifs lifting from her shoulders. "I'm happy to hear that, and I'm happy to have met you, Betty. You're the living proof that even impossible love creates something lasting." They talked for another hour, about lives lived, choices made, roads not taken. Margaret shared stories about Edward that Betty had never known. His terrible sense of direction, his addiction to coffee, his habit of humming while he worked. Small details that made him more human, more real. When Margaret finally left, promising to visit the art center again when the weather improved, Betty sat alone in the office and felt something shift inside her. The story wasn't just hers anymore. It wasn't just Elizabeth and Edward's. It was expanding, incorporating Margaret's perspective, Michael's inheritance, David's understanding, all the artists and visitors and community members who would pass through the warehouse and absorb its history in ways both conscious and unconscious. Love stories, Betty realized, never really end. They just grow, accumulating witnesses and interpretations and meanings until they become larger than the original two people who started them. As spring arrived and the Warehouse Art Center celebrated its first anniversary, Betty received another piece of the puzzle. A letter arrived from a genealogy service she had submitted DNA to months ago. A whim, a desire to confirm what she already knew in her heart. The results were exactly as expected. No biological connection to Thomas Harrison or his relatives, but a 50% match to someone named Edward Mitchell Jr., registered in the database as deceased in 2019. Edward had had another child, a son, from his brief marriage to Margaret. Betty had a half-brother she had never known about, who had lived and died without either of them knowing the other existed. She stared at the name on the screen, feeling the familiar ache of missed connections and lost time. Edward Mitchell Jr. would have been her senior by several years, a brother who might have shared her eyes, her tendency toward introspection, her appreciation for beauty in unexpected places. But the database showed something else. Edward Mitchell Jr. had children, grandchildren, a family tree that extended to the present day, with several relatives still alive and registered in the system. Betty had cousins, a whole branch of family connected by the blood of a man who had loved two women. One he was supposed to marry, one he wasn't supposed to love. She spent days debating whether to reach out, whether to disturb lives that had been proceeding peacefully without knowledge of her existence. In the end, curiosity, that same curiosity that had led her to buy a warehouse for a handful of coins, won out. She sent a carefully worded message through the genealogy service to the closest match, a woman named Claire Mitchell, granddaughter of Edward Mitchell Jr. 3 weeks later, Claire drove to Millbrook with her teenage daughter, Emma. They met in the Warehouse Art Center, in the main gallery beneath the painting of Elizabeth in her garden. Claire was 62, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a musical laugh. Emma was 16, shy and artistic, with sketchbooks tucked under her arm, and both of them had gray-green eyes that made Betty's heart ache with recognition. "My father never talked about his father," Claire said as Betty showed them through the memorial office. "Dad died when I was young, and what little I knew came from my grandmother, Margaret. She remarried after my grandfather Edward died, and she didn't like to discuss her first marriage. I always had the sense there was a story there, but I never pushed. There was definitely a story, Betty said with a slight smile. She told them, this new branch of family connected by circumstance and DNA. She told them about Elizabeth and Edward, about impossible love and tragic endings, about secrets kept and truths discovered. She showed them the letters, the photographs, the painting. Claire listened with growing wonder, occasionally glancing at the memorial displays, then back at Betty, as if trying to reconcile the story with the evidence of shared genetics written in their matching eyes. Emma, however, was captivated. She moved from artifact to artifact, drinking in the details with an artist's attention. When Betty finished the story, Emma asked softly, "Can I paint them? Edward and Elizabeth? For a school project about family history?" "I think they would love that," Betty said, her voice thick with emotion. And so the story expanded again, incorporating these new relatives, these inheritors of Edward's artistic sensibility and Elizabeth's determination. Claire became a regular visitor to Millbrook, helping with the Art Center's educational programs. Emma spent her summer before senior year interning at the center, creating a massive mural in the main gallery that depicted the warehouse as it existed across time, thriving in the 1950s with workers and textiles, empty and forgotten in the decades between, alive again with artists and community. At the center of the mural, almost hidden among the other details, Emma painted two figures, a man and a woman, their hands almost touching, surrounded by roses that bloomed impossibly through concrete and time. Betty stood before the mural on the day it was unveiled, surrounded by family she hadn't known existed a year ago. Michael and David stood to her left, Claire and Emma to her right, and scattered throughout the crowd were the artists, students, and community members who had made the warehouse into something living and vital. "My great-grandmother Elizabeth used to tell me something," Betty said, her voice carrying through the large space. "At least, I think she did. Memory is tricky when you're that young, but I remember her hands holding mine, and I remember words about gardens growing in unexpected places." She paused, looking at the mural, at the garden Emma had painted blooming through industrial decay. "I spent most of my life thinking I knew who I was, the daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth Harrison, a widow, a mother, a woman with a small, manageable story. And then, at 79, I bought a warehouse for pocket change and discovered I was wrong about almost everything." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd. "I discovered that my mother loved someone she wasn't supposed to love, that my father raised me without knowing I wasn't biologically his, that my real father died never having spoken to me, but loving me nonetheless. I discovered that family is more complicated than blood, and that love is more powerful than the rules we make to contain it." Betty's eyes found Margaret in the crowd. Yes, Margaret had returned, drawn by the mysterious pull of completed stories. Their gazes met, an understanding passed between them. "I discovered that it's never too late to learn the truth, never too late to expand your understanding of who you are and where you came from, never too late to honor the loves that made you possible, even the forbidden ones, especially the forbidden ones." She turned to face the crowd fully. This warehouse was abandoned for over 40 years. People thought it was worthless, a tear down, a waste of space. But it was waiting for someone to see its value, to understand that forgotten places hold the most important memories. Her voice softened, grew more intimate. "If you're listening to this story, wherever you are, I want you to hear me. You are never too old to discover something new about yourself. You are never too late to honor the truth. You are never past the point where love can transform everything you thought you knew." The crowd was silent, absorbed in her words. Edward and Elizabeth loved each other across impossible circumstances. They created me in a moment of weakness that was also a moment of profound strength. They died together, choosing truth over safety in their final hours. And now, 6 decades later, their love has brought together a family that didn't know it existed, and created a space where other people can pursue their own impossible loves. Betty gestured to the warehouse around them. This is their legacy, not tragedy, not scandal, but transformation. Love that refuses to end, that echoes forward through generations, that builds something beautiful from something that was supposed to be forgotten. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had finally, completely understood. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Edward, for being brave enough to love when love was dangerous, for creating me, even accidentally, for leaving behind these letters and paintings and artifacts that would one day guide me home to a truth I didn't know I needed. She paused, then added softly, and thank you, Thomas Harrison, for raising me as your own, for loving me without conditions, for being my father in every way that mattered. This story has room for all of you. The crowd erupted in applause, and Betty felt tears streaming down her face, tears of release, of completion, of joy that came from finally standing in the full light of her own story. After the ceremony, as people mingled and examined Emma's mural more closely, Betty climbed the stairs to the office one more time. The sun was setting, casting the same amber light through the windows that she had first seen that October day when everything changed. She sat at the desk, Edward's desk, and pulled out a piece of paper. She had one more letter to write, not to Elizabeth or Edward, who were beyond words now, but to herself, to the Betty who had stood in this space 6 months ago, confused and overwhelmed by revelations that shattered everything she thought she knew. Dear Betty, you made it. You walked through the confusion and the grief, and the overwhelming complexity of discovering that your life was not what you thought it was. You survived learning that the man who raised you was not your biological father, and you managed to love him no less fiercely for it. You found family in unexpected places. You honored a love story that society said should be forgotten. You built something beautiful from ruins, both literal and metaphorical. You learned that it's never too late to discover truth, never too late to expand your understanding of love, never too late to begin again. At 79, you bought a warehouse for pocket change and found your entire history. At 80, you're creating a future for people who need to know that their loves and truths and identities matter, no matter how impossible they seem. Edward and Elizabeth would be proud. Thomas would be proud. And more importantly, you should be proud of yourself. Keep going. Keep discovering. Keep building gardens in unexpected places. With love, Betty. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a new box, her box, that would sit alongside Elizabeth's and Edward's on the desk. Future generations would find it, would understand that this story didn't end with tragedy in 1963, but continued, evolved, and eventually became something like hope. As the last light faded from the sky, Betty heard footsteps on the stairs. Michael appeared in the doorway, David just behind him. "You okay, Grandma?" Michael asked. "More than okay," Betty replied. "I'm complete. Ready to head home? Claire's making dinner at your place. Emma's already there helping." Betty stood, her joints protesting slightly, her body reminding her that she was, in fact, 79 years old and had been pushing hard for 6 months. But her spirit felt ageless, renewed by purpose and truth, and the kind of love that transcends time and death and the small boundaries humans try to impose on it. "I'm ready," she said, "but I need one more minute." Michael and David nodded and descended the stairs, giving her space. Betty stood in the center of the office, surrounded by the artifacts of an impossible love, and spoke aloud one final time. "Thank you," she whispered to the silence, to the dust motes still dancing in the last rays of light, to the ghosts that weren't really ghosts, but memories that had been given voice. "Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for these 6 months of discovery. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't follow rules, and that the best stories are the ones we're told we shouldn't tell." She touched the painting gently. Elizabeth in her garden, created by Edward's loving hands. "I'll keep telling your story," she promised. "Not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Not as something shameful, but as something sacred. You loved impossibly, and that impossible love created me, and I've created something from it too." She smiled, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the door. Before descending the stairs, she turned back one last time. The office looked peaceful in the gathering dark. A memorial, yes, but not a tomb. A celebration, a testament, a promise that love matters more than the rules designed to contain it. Betty descended the stairs, locked the warehouse door behind her, and walked out into the cool evening air. Above her, stars were beginning to emerge. The same stars that had watched over Elizabeth and Edward, over their secret meetings and their tragic ending, over decades of silence and secrets. But now those stars watched over something different. A warehouse transformed into a haven, a family expanded beyond recognition, a woman who had discovered at 79 that her story was larger and stranger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. In the distance, she could hear laughter from her apartment. Her grandson and his partner, her newly discovered cousin, her young relative who carried Edward's artistic gene forward into another generation. A family built not just on blood, but on shared truth and chosen connection. Betty walked toward that laughter, toward the warm light spilling from her windows, toward the life that was still unfolding even at her age. Behind her, the warehouse stood solid and purposeful, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. Some buildings, like some loves, just need someone brave enough to see their value, someone willing to pay a few coins for something everyone else has dismissed, someone ready to discover that the most important things in life are often the ones we find in the most unexpected places. Betty had been that someone, and in being brave enough to open a door she could have walked past, she had found not just a warehouse, but a history. Not just a history, but a purpose. Not just a purpose, but a family. Not just a family, but herself. Fully, completely, finally. The warehouse on Elm Street had held its secrets for over 40 years, waiting patiently for the one person who needed them most. And when that person finally arrived, an elderly woman with pocket change and curiosity, it had given up those secrets gladly, transforming both the building and the woman in the process. This is what love does. It waits, it endures, it transforms. It refuses to be contained by time or circumstance or even death. It echoes forward through generations, changing everyone it touches, building cathedrals from ruins, creating gardens in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it waits in an abandoned warehouse, ready to reveal itself to someone brave enough to turn the key. Thank you truly for staying with Betty through this entire journey. From that first day when she stood before a crumbling warehouse, to the moment she finally understood the full weight and beauty of her own story. Her tale reminds us that our lives are never quite what they seem on the surface. That the people who came before us carried loves and losses and secrets we may never fully understand. That discovering the truth, even when it's complicated and painful, is better than living in comfortable ignorance. At 79, Betty could have let that warehouse remain a mystery. She could have torn it down, sold the land, moved on, but she didn't. She was brave enough to climb those stairs, open those drawers, read those letters. She was brave enough to let her entire understanding of herself be transformed. And in doing so, she created something lasting. Not just an art center, but a legacy, a testament to the power of truth, the endurance of love, and the possibility of beginning again, no matter how many years you've lived. What secrets might be waiting in your own family's forgotten places? What truths have been carefully preserved, hidden away, waiting for someone brave enough to discover them? What part of your own story are you still waiting to understand? Betty's journey shows us that it's never too late to seek answers. Never too late to honor the loves that made us possible. Never too late to transform something abandoned into something beautiful. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own history differently, or gave you courage to seek truths you've been avoiding, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your thoughts. Tell me about discoveries you've made about your own family. Let me know what resonated with you. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to this channel. Every story here is about people like Betty, people who discover at what seems like the end that they're really at a beginning, people who prove that age is just a number, and that the most important chapters of our lives can be written at any time. Until the next story, remember, love leaves traces, truth waits patiently, and abandoned warehouses sometimes hold the most precious treasures. If we're brave enough to step inside, keep seeking, keep discovering, keep believing that it's never, ever too late.